Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It is another Big Boys Table. Hi, Mesk.
Hi.
It's very early in the morning for Mesk, so he may be sleepier than usual.
I'm
throwing
definitely
that out there.
sleepier than usual.
So today we're going to be talking about player education, and it's basically the idea of like how games can reinforce that without being condescending, of course, like in an ideal scenario. But the idea being that certain games actually do not only incentivize or mandate that you are good enough at them in order to pass a certain skill check, they also will give you metrics and some other way to track how good you are relative to how good you should be, or stuff like that. And there's all sorts of different systems that have been attempted down the years that not only are good for players who are learning, but also good for players who are already good and just want to keep tracking how far they're improving or how far away they are from the top. Things like leaderboards, and of course in like the ARPG sense in Devil May Cry, there's always that like scoring system and stuff that they always had, which of course can be abused in certain cases, but generally speaking, same deal with shmups. There's like certain prestige that gets associated with high scores in those games, and the idea being that generally you need to have high skill in order to get a high score. So this dates back all the way to like the arcade games, back before games were seen as a vehicle for storytelling in a more conventional sense, because people started pumping in like hundreds of millions of dollars for cutscene budgets, which is insane. So before then, when you just were trying to play
Funny how
a
it
game,
never resulted in any good cutscenes.
yeah, I'm still waiting for some. But you end up getting, going all the way back, you end up finding games that just do that. They just have a level of, expectation for your skill. We can talk about difficulty levels into this context as well, like the idea that there are no difficulty levels in all those old games. You're either good enough or you aren't. The very first Mario level kills so many bad gamers. Some of the early StarCraft 1 missions, actually, like the third, because 3, Terran mission, is kind of infamous in that nature, even though obviously it's not challenging for an experienced RTS player. If you just rock around at 40 APM and you're like not even moving the command center closer to your mineral line and stuff, there's all sorts of things that can destroy you and will destroy you, usually at the end of a 30-minute holdout section, which is actually infuriating and stupid and doesn't really give you much to improve upon in theory. Certain mechanics are also like not at all explained by way of the tutorial, which is super on rails and all this other stuff. So like that, but that is an example of a game that does say, hey, you need to be this good to pass, and that's very rare to find examples of that in the modern day, for sure. So we want to talk a little bit about player education, how players can use the tools that games give them to improve without needing to go look up a guide or a wiki, without needing to consult other players. While these are always going to be resources that communities put together, they shouldn't be relied upon. I don't think they shouldn't be a requirement for improvement in that sense. I don't know how you feel about the whole external media flavoring how players experience their games. I generally find it to be pretty bad.
It is like, that's something, like, I've been able to get through pretty much every single game without using external references until I reached the mobile games. Like, I started off with Puzzle and Dragons. Now, an example I gave in an article I wrote a while ago about this kind of insanity is the units in Puzzle and Dragons have a lot of abilities you unlock on them, but they don't actually give you hard numbers of what they do. It'll be just like, this multiplies the attack of the monster when you gain like 7 combos or whatever. The game doesn't tell you it's like a 2 times multiplier, and it stacks multiplicatively. So it's actually kind of a big deal, where if you're not reading stuff in the way that you should be reading it, you're misunderstanding that you could be turning, like, say, like a 3-digit number into literally like a 9 or 10-digit number. So yeah, like, the entire basis of the game is built on this shit, and the only way to find that out is to find it through an external user-created wiki, which has just been an accepted standard of these games for basically everything. I mean, not all of them are quite as important as PAD in that regard, but like FGO, for example, you can get to that entire game without ever referencing an external source. But nothing about the game actually tells you what stuff is actually doing. It just says increases your attack. Well, by how much does it stack? Like, these are all questions you've got to ask whenever you're dealing with any kind of element that has numbers that are applied on top of each other. But the games never fucking tell you this shit. And then you've got fucking Azur Lane, where There's some abilities that stack and some abilities that don't stack, and they weren't consistent in their labeling and stuff like that. And then you have the English wiki that everybody uses, and it's run by pedophiles and is just terribly organized. And they just come up with their own fucking conventions for everything. And then, if you ever heard, like, the 99% of external guides out there are just all fucking brain dead. So, like, you're just filled with misinformation everywhere. Like, the assumption, the erroneous and foolhardy assumption that the information you're going to reference out of the game is accurate to begin with is something also that you got to worry about when you're dealing with this kind of shit, because now you're placing your faith in somebody else's unproven credentials that the information they have is actually correct or not. Like, Azur Lane, for example, Bismarck was data mined out of the game years before she actually showed up, and the fucking retards of the English wiki just assumed that she was going to be a rainbow rarity ship. Well, guess what? They finally released her, and she wasn't. So anybody who had actually taken any of this value, any of this stuff at face value because, they data mined the game, it was actually factually incorrect in the end of the day. So, like, this is one example, but there's so many examples of that where relying on a third-party source for your information just results in complete stupidity. But it's stupid as a concept anyways. You shouldn't ever need to have something else telling you information. Like, if the game doesn't tell you the information you need to operate, then what the fuck is it doing?
Yeah, well, we've always criticized stuff like brazen tooltips that go too far the other way, where they exposition you all the information without allowing you to see stuff like certain behaviors or whatever. But I do think that non-pop-up tooltips where you just mouse over a button in an RTS or something should have a terse but comprehensive understanding. Or
at least should give you some idea of what something fucking does.
Yeah. And for sure, some stuff can be done through, like, I mean, you were just talking about inaccurate fan-made or community monitored software or documentation. That is true of Team Liquid, even in the modern era when it comes to some of the Brood War information they have on there. And to think that the game has been out for over 20 years and they still haven't corrected this shit. No. So
wikis are dumb. Like, they're really dumb. Wikis are just like fucking FOSS shit, where people make a wiki and then they just intentionally leave it incomplete because they think somebody else is gonna fucking pick up the slack. But everybody who operates on a fucking wiki thinks that way. So, just like FOSS, nothing gets fucking done.
Yeah. So you just end up in a situation where you're waiting for everybody else to do it, and you sort of absolve yourself of any responsibility to fill it in completely as an individual. So when that is happening on a grand scale, you're bound to get a lot of inaccurate information. And when it comes to tooltips themselves, I mean, so an example that made me think of this concept, earlier this week, I was watching a guy he claims to have never played an RTS game, but he was playing StarCraft 1, and he was at that aforementioned holdout mission that killed him, and almost killed him a second time, but it killed him the first time because he wasn't sure what was going on. And I had not watched his whole playthrough of this mission, but I came in and his command center was like 40 feet from the mineral line, which is farther away from where you start from the area. So he had moved it. And I was able to figure out he actually had tried to build a ComSat station, but nowhere in the game does it tell you if you don't place it like next to the building, it's going to lift the structure off and fly to wherever you planted it, right? So that happened, and he still doesn't even know that liftoff is a thing. I mean, that's his own fault for not looking at the buttons, I guess, but he doesn't even know about liftoff as a mechanic, and so he thinks that it moves the command center and then lands it, and you can't pick it up again, and I was like, oh no, you can lift that off again. But, that's an instance where the game's communication clearly failed to tell him about maneuvering buildings and stuff, which is, at this point, it's something so ingrained in everybody else's memory you don't really need to necessarily tutorialize that, but having some line about liftoff, or maybe introducing the Terran race in the first mission of like the tutorial or something, to actually have their structures landing or something to show you that this capacity exists for the game, is clearly something that Blizzard could have done. That would be super simple. That wouldn't even necessarily need any dialogue, because you click on the command center and the one button you have besides move and stop is lift off, or land rather.
This is very obviously something they had a problem with in StarCraft 2 because nobody in their staff had played StarCraft 1, including their lead designer, because precisely the things you said are what they do in StarCraft 2 over and over and over again. And also, when you push the add-on button in StarCraft 2, it just automatically drops it now.
Right, yeah. You actually have to lift off first and then push the button if you want to do something like that, yeah. Which might actually be the more user-friendly and common sense thing to do, but at the same time,
it's less clicks in the grand scheme of thing, right?
Yeah. So maybe that ends up being more user-friendly, but at the same time, I don't know if they changed that because of that reasoning or they changed it because people were getting confused about the structures landing and lifting off and whatever. So who knows what their motivation behind it was, but for sure, like communicating the idea that structures can even lift off and land was not done at any point up until way later on in the Terran campaign, where you just start out with a bunch of structures that are waiting to land. I think in the 7th mission or 8th mission or something. And so like at that point, it's just like, oh, like if you never did that, which is completely possible to go through the entire campaign up until that point, not having to lift off a structure, not ever doing that incidentally, you would be like, why is my base flying? And like that would be the first time you see it, and it's like an end game mission, so end of campaign mission basically. So yeah, it's one of those weird things where like it's obviously a very small example that most people are already familiar with inside and out. So maybe it's not so relatable, but the idea is, people are actually like who are completely new to RTS games, who are completely new to StarCraft, aren't going to know basic shit like liftoff, how it works and that it exists at all, and stuff like that can happen to them. So another thing that this gentleman did on his stream for StarCraft was he actually had played, or at the end of it, he had been like dividing the APM that it showed him at the end of the score screen, and he had divided that by the number of minutes that he played, and he was like, "Oh, that's pretty bad APM. I got to get higher." And that was making me think of metrics and like how you can communicate certain objective things that maybe they're not going to be great because like maybe at the end of your game you didn't have to do too much, so you didn't actually click as much because you were already winning, so your APM like goes over there. So maybe you could have like a graph of some sort with regards to APM that would be more useful, but also just giving him an average so he didn't have to do the calculation that he did or something like that. Maybe he was multiplying instead of dividing. I don't know what he was doing actually to figure it out, but some sort of metric like APM at the end of the mission is useful for players to figure out like whether or not they're on point enough, or like that's the example of a metric where you can look at that just like you can look at your score in a shmup or something like that, and you can contrast that against a more experienced player and see an objective and numerical representation of how far away you are from them, and that can be useful for your own degree of improvement. And obviously, we're not suggesting that we should beat people over the head with these statistics. They should exist for people who want them, just like the score screen already does. Like that, it already gives you
just like losses, because Blizzard felt that you shouldn't have losses on your record anymore because that scares away players.
Yeah, that's an example of going too far the other way. The thing with the information for me is just that giving it to the players who actually want to use it is good, and that's one of those things that you don't really see in games, particularly like StarCraft 2, removing losses from the record, like Insanity, or whatever they were doing. I think they did something else with StarCraft 2 where I think they removed a custom game match win loss or something so that you could practice in custom games or something differently. I don't remember exactly what that was, but there was some way to like tick a box to hide those. Either way, though, it's like just the idea of hiding publicly available stats doesn't make any sense to me either. And certainly, replay systems also help with this sort of thing for improvement for players. And only players who actually want to improve and actually want to use these numbers for something are going to actually look at them. So, that could be something where they can just see a low APM or a high average resources floated or something, and say like, oh, these are areas I can work on in the future. That could be something that they can worry about take it into the next game as soon as they start the next game or next mission or whatever it is. And I think that's perfectly reasonable as far as metrics go, to give players some tools to analyze their own play. And, they take these stats and make of them what they will. The game isn't necessarily giving you an immediate, StarCraft 2 did a weird thing where, like, every time you exceeded your high score for an APM or supply block time or something, it'd give you a little star, and it'd be like, this is your best average yet or something. And it's like, all right, man, maybe you don't need to do that. That seems a little on the nose. So the stuff like that does occur, but for me, it's more about like providing these stats to players. And obviously you're in the middle of sort of varied developments, but was there a way that this ties back to either your D&D stuff or your ARPG that you were working on at some point? And were you considering any sort of scoring system or any sort of statistics that players could track to improve their ability to handle situations?
Well, when I talked a lot with some people about the scoring system from DMC and how it's basically there as a distraction. I was gonna have an achievement system, where like there was only about a handful of achievements, and one of them was to take no damage in the entire game. So that was gonna be one way of tracking it. I was trying to think of other ways I could track stuff, but I usually I try to think of things that like actively award you for playing it. I try to think of things that you don't really think of as like a scoring system, but it's something that you actually feel when you improve, so that people feel, you know, sort of like they want to improve rather than like they have to improve. Because one of the big problems with modern software is that instant gratification has destroyed the entire like desire to improve, period. And now you have the generation of people, especially, you know, the newer millennials and the Zoomers and the Coomers, who basically have no desire to improve at all. And one of the things you end up noticing a lot with these people is that a lot of these people who have no quality standards also have no desire to improve, and they also are very unhappy with their lives a lot of the time. I've definitely noticed a trend with that with a lot of the casters and stuff that you people have associated with, like Jay Brino, for example. They just live really, really unfulfilling lives. You can hear it in their voice. They're just kind of soulless and dead because they have no standards. They have no measurement by which to, you know, improve and see their improvement. And they have no standards in any of the products they consume. So there's no way that they can even assess anything like that. And then I haven't watched extensively his playstyle, but I've heard that the playstyle of a lot of these people is also really terrible. They're just not good players by any extent of the imagination.
Yeah, and generally they don't have any
understand that
drive to
too.
improve either. Like the same is true for
Yeah.
like Loco and stuff like that. As far as I understand, you know, some of these bigger names in particular, they're kind of set in their ways, and it's almost like they don't want to change because they also don't like they feel an attachment based on what they currently do to an attachment, as well as like the fact that their viewers are usually there for that reason, right? So I don't really know what to make of that in particular, like the connection to the viewers. That's obviously external of connections to the games, but it does definitely seems like it's at least an excuse they rely on a lot when it comes to that sort of thing. Like, oh, if I start to focus on trying to become a better player, then my commentary is going to suffer, and I don't want to deal with that because then my viewers aren't going to. It's like some externalization of an internal failure to be motivated and failure to improve.
Not that their commentary was really any noteworthy anyway, but it's
Well,
something that
what
kind of
makes the
stands
money,
out to me.
so, yeah.
Yeah, well, I think almost all these people only make money because they were just like the first bird gets the worm kind of thing. That
Yeah.
really seems to be a lot of the case.
Sort of
with a
like
lot
World of
stuff.
Warcraft, right? When it comes to
But
products.
I mean, that's okay starting off, but it does remind me a lot of a very similar toxic interaction I saw with custom content back in StarCraft, where back in Maplantis and stuff like that, people just always assumed all modders were bad at the game, and they just had accepted that. Like, they just had accepted that people who make maps and mods have to be bad at the game, and like to me that was absolutely baffling, because I think in order to make a good map, even just a simple melee, especially even just a simple melee map, you actually have to understand the game at the professional level. You have to be intimately familiar with how the game is played. You may not necessarily need to be like an A+ player yourself at the minimum, but you need to have some grasp of how the game is played. You do need to have a minimum APM of like 120, 130. You need to at least like understand like how you can improve to reach a professional level. And you absolutely need to understand the game at a professional level.
Right.
Of course, nobody there even made the effort to do so. And I think that in order to do even casual commentary, like say the level of like Jay Bruno, you have to meet the same requirements as well. Because when you're casting for a casual audience, you have to understand what the casual audience can actually disseminate from your casts. And if you don't even understand what you're even talking about, then yeah, you really offer absolutely no educational value to anybody at all, which has generally been one of the reasons why I don't watch a lot of people who cast videos for this stuff, because, well, for one, I either find them incredibly irritating, or two, it's just not educational for me. So, like, that was, like, I was watching those Age of Empires videos some people on your server were linking earlier.
Right.
And well, I found the guy to be like his recording quality to be really abysmal, which is really funny because when you see one of his face cam shots, he's got like a huge wall of treated foam behind him. But for some reason, he's sitting on top of a wooden floor, and there's like this giant, like all these barricades around him and stuff like that that are all just reverberating the sound fucking everywhere. So his audio quality is like some of the worst I've ever actually heard in a long time. But he actually like tries to at least sort of explain why people are doing some stuff. Some stuff he doesn't explain that well at all, but some stuff he does explain. So that was nice to see because he's obviously like testing like higher level games in some portions, and he's trying to explain some of the decisions they make. I think he could go more in depth with them and some of the reasoning behind them. But I'm at a level where I may not be familiar with the game. I don't understand the technical nuances of the game, but I understand the decisions of why people make certain decisions they make. So he gives me enough information where I can draw the correlations between, okay, so this is happening because he ultimately wants to do this. It's why I can understand high-level gameplay for, say, example, Quake or Counter-Strike or any of these other titles that I'm not intimately familiar with. I'm at a skill level and where I can understand the psychology of the players. But most people are not like that. Most people don't understand this stuff. And that ultimately, for designers, leads into the problem where they end up with a lot of balancing issues because they don't understand the psychology behind why players make certain decisions and how that leads into balancing issues and leads to them exploiting certain things that you might find surprising. Like way back in ITAS, there was I had a mod night game with Matt Blantis at some point, and a lot of these people had played the mod before. And they all assumed that undead were incredibly overpowered because undead can get some of the stronger high-tier units, but they are very expensive. And they had always assumed that the Xenon Project was underpowered. So we played a game, I played Xenon Project, and I just steamrolled a whole lot of them without any real effort at all because I actually understood how all the units worked. And it wasn't that they hadn't played the project before, it's just that since they were just terrible, they didn't actually really understand or make any effort to understand how any of this stuff actually worked, but thought that they were capable of actually judging what was balanced in the project or not compared to, its developer. So it was just one of those many examples where it brought me back to their statement that all modders and all mappers have to be bad at the game, so that's why the balance is bad, and then they just assume that that's just something that's inescapable and they can't get away from it. In much the same sense that there is a general consensus I've heard that casters have to be bad at the game. And that's obviously not the case because, you had Artosis and Tasteless and stuff like that, who were at least were, fairly competent in the Western scene at their heyday.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of casters start out as players anyway, and then they can't hack it as the elite of the elite, but they still have a lot of experience playing, sometimes for pro teams. You see this in Counter-Strike as well. A lot of the casters are high-level players, and pretty much every caster
in the
has
Korean
some
scene
understanding
especially.
Of it at the very least. Yeah.
And Brood War is really, really common for professional players to eventually turn into casters. And like I said before, the casters in Korean scene, they know a lot more about the game than pretty much everybody in the West, professional or otherwise. And I'm sure that's the case for a lot of other titles as well, like League. It's a lot of trends get set by either China or Korea, at least they were back in the day. But, it sort of brings me back to the whole point where a lot of these people, they just sort of just like accept that they're stuck in this spot and they can't really get out of it. And they don't really look at it from the route of self-improvement. And like I said, it tends to tie in with a whole bunch of other experiences and stuff they endure. And again, this is something I have a problem with because, for one, I don't really play games that much, especially within like the last 15 years or so. And I only started doing public casting back in like 2009. I was making videos long before then, but it was just, the compilations and stuff like that and modding related stuff. So, of course, when I switched into doing stuff with StarCraft 2, it became really evident that, my sparse playing of Brood War prior to then wasn't really going to cut it. I had to basically modernize everything. And I basically went from being like a D- level all the way into a master's level. Well, it was just diamond back then, high diamond, and StarCraft 2 back in beta. And it still wasn't really that good. Like, I wasn't at the top 100, but I was close. And I could understand that I could get better. But more importantly, what really drove me to improve was actually the casting. Because there was always, like, this is something that's always a problem. It's something that's always bothered me. Is that I feel like if you're going to produce a video where you are the perspective, and this goes regardless of the genre, you owe it to yourself to at least try to play at a competent level and try to improve. It's not just about being an entertainer. It's not just about being a color commentator. It's also about providing a viewing experience, because typically a video series is viewed as a start to finish. It's sort of a journey in a way. And I don't know of anybody who enjoys watching somebody play games who is actually like bad at them and has no intention to improve. I don't know anybody who stomachs watching the average YouTube caster. Like, they just can't stand them. This is one of the main reasons why a lot of these people don't have the stringent, standards on their casting. They watch stuff like Vinny and and Joel and stuff like that on Twitch, so they don't really care too much about a lot of the the casting styles. It's more like what the content is, and the content usually has to have people trying to do something. But at the same time, again, a lot of the content doesn't really give you a measurement to improve. So my standards come down to the fact that I want to improve as a person. I want to improve as a player. So I may not put a lot of time into it, but the time into it, I try to improve. And of course, I try to do all my runs blind as well. So that obviously can make things really difficult. Like for Final Fantasy VI, obviously I hadn't played hardly any JRPGs in my life prior to that point. That one was kind of a disaster. But towards the end of the game, I had sort of understood sort of what I was kind of trying to do, and it worked out in the end. And then obviously there was games like R-Type 3 as well that were obviously, when I started it was an absolute train wreck, but towards the end of the game I was getting a little bit better. I mean, obviously it was still something that would have taken me years to reach a real competent level in, but I did manage to clear it. And I guarantee you a lot of these YouTube casters never could actually clear that game, much less in only the 7 hours or whatever I did. And that's the thing though, it's like the measurement was myself. I wanted to improve, wanted to complete it. A lot of these people just won't even try to complete these things. They won't really try to get into them at all. But there isn't, like, the content they do expose themselves to, like, say, for example, StarCraft Customs. They don't have a measurement to improve because they've done all they can to remove player skill from the equation. And that's something that Blizzard has popularized and Riot has popularized is instant gratification or removal of skill expression. Everything that you derive from what like difficulty is, and everything you derive from what reads and stuff like that, it all comes down to skill expression. How is the player's interaction with the title exposed? Now in Brood War, there are so many nuances that it's really like beyond human physical capability to master all of them all at once. It's really just not popular. Or really not possible. I'm fucking tired and it makes my bad English even worse. So, you had like Boxer, who people were like, oh yeah, Boxer's known primarily for his micro and not really his macro. And of course his APM would shoot up to like 500, 600 plus or something like that. So his macro was still better than anyone in the West could really possibly hope to reach. But then you had, people, I think Jay Dong was one of them, who's more well known for their macro. Even at like the peak of the peak of the peak of skill, you still had certain playstyles and stuff deviate based on what the individual strengths were. And I don't know, like there's something that kind of like bothers me a lot about the West, and that's how they view the Korean scene in terms of their practicing, where they take practicing very, very seriously. They have the training houses, the club houses, or whatever they are, the team houses, I forget their exact names, but they would basically live in something sort of like an apartment where they trained like 8 to 10 hours a day. And, people would be like, oh, you that's so lame. You got no life, lol. And you forget that these guys are actually like, this is their job. They're being paid. And they're living in way more comfortable circumstances than most of these people will ever live to. And, they're with their friends and shit like that. Like, they are practicing a lot and they take it very seriously. And that is ultimately where comments like that comes from, is Westerners just don't understand what it's like to have discipline. Westerners just don't understand what it's like to be really actually dedicated. I mean, there is Western team houses as well, but they don't take it as seriously, and the results show. It's not just that Koreans are the master race. It's also that Westerners have no real discipline in comparison to them. There's a massive difference between the Western houses and the Korean houses, and the results always showed within Brood War. And it also showed in with the cultural differences as well. Then whenever they collided, you'd always see those kinds of comments, and it always just made me laugh. It's like, yes, the people who actually have the dedication and discipline and are succeeding because of it, there's something wrong with that. The biggest issue, of course, for Korea was the military draft, but that, that's his own thing. But
I think the biggest
Obviously,
concern when it comes to the ridiculous training, I mean, I say ridiculous not as in a way to say that it's bad because of the results. It's obviously like it creates results. The problem is that there's a huge turnover rate in Korea, and there's not a whole lot, just as a culture, there's not a whole lot of individuality there. Now, there's a couple of different ways that you can describe Asian culture in general, but a lot of it ends up being like, they have those tiger parents that really do get on their kids to be as great as they can be, and that includes in video games. But there's not a whole lot of room left for personal development outside of whatever your chosen line of work ends up being, which is
it ends up being like that in the West, though. Like, it's not the same kind of culture because in the West, parents just kind of like cease to exist at this point. But it is still a thing in the West where if you want to succeed, it costs you everything you are.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Like
you do have to throw yourself at it.
Crunch time is a Western concept by design. They love it. Everybody else adopted it eventually, of course, but in the Western, crunch time has been an in thing. Now, in Japan, they have crunch time too, and they don't really talk about it, even though it is a very, very serious problem. In that, it's a company first and person second. And there was actually, I don't know where it was linked. If it was linked in your server or linked in another server, there was a lot of Asian people I talked to. But it was just like a very rudimentary businessman level, dealing with Japanese business culture and how they're different from ours and stuff like that. And really, it was from a Japanese source, I think it was. It was for a multicultural company. And what it really just drummed down to is that Japanese take business seriously. All the paragraphs of text were really just down to Japanese take business seriously. And, well, now you have declining birth rate worldwide for whites in general, but in Japan, obviously, that's much more of a forefront issue. But part of that is usually work, but it's also the nature of it's a complicated thing. It's too much to get into, but at the end of the day, a lot of people take stuff very seriously in Japan, and Japan is held to a much higher level of quality and a much, important and measurable margin of success over other countries in many regards. Like, say, for example, technology. Say, for example, research and stuff like that. And Korea as well. I mean, back in the day of Rude always, a lot of people think about Korea as the epicenter of internet technology because, their ISPs and stuff like that were a lot better in the West. I mean, obviously, censorship and weird religious insanity and other craziness kind of took over, but generally, the individual, the parenting for Asian stuff is really fascinating because I've never experienced it. Obviously, I don't have any parents, and I don't know anybody who really has parents like this. But to me, it seems like the most bizarre thing to have parents that want you to succeed. That to me is really alien. That's a really alien concept. But I have talked to Asian people on the internet who say, oh, it's really annoying because my mother and father are always badgering. There's someone I talked to, and she says that her mother, doesn't want her marrying somebody who isn't a citizen because she is, afraid to the point of beyond paranoia that her daughter's going to get scanned by somebody who's using her just to get a green card or something like that, whatever that is in the U.S.
Yeah.
Here in Canada, we just allow bin Laden over. We don't give a fuck who you are, what you're going to do to us. But in the U.S., obviously, that's much more of an actual serious issue, like it should be. But her mother is actually insane. There's a long discussion about this, and it's her mother would just would refuse, would actually go suicidal. So that to me is so weird. It's so weird. All the parents of people that I have known, they don't give a fuck what happens to their kid at all. But now Asians are obviously different. But at the same time, when you think about Asians, what are the stereotypes that follow Asians? They're good at math. They're good at science. They're smart. Stuff like that. And stereotypes exist for a reason. There's things that create stereotypes. And that's because, yes, a very large number of Asians that I have met, I would consider above average intelligence academically. And academic success is success. And therefore, they have, good potential for scoring good jobs, for succeeding in whatever adventures they want, hobby-wise, if they want to. I think a bigger issue is a lot of them just don't actually have pursuits, personal pursuits, so they actually want to pursue at the end of the day. But that's an issue everybody has, regardless of who they are.
For sure, it seems like a lack of personal development isn't an exclusively Asian thing. It just seems to me that they could channel it a little bit more, like a little bit less on the paranoia and insanity side of the example that you were giving about, being hyper vigilant over marriage stuff, and a little bit more concerned about, like, if they were able to channel the same degree of concern and attention into the children, as far as they, like, not just their academics and not just their success when it comes to finances and job, career stuff, but also in terms of personal development, I think that they would end up being a little bit healthier. But that is an example of a group of individuals who are definitely going to bite on something that allows them to track how good they are at a certain thing, like we were talking about earlier with the player education side of things. There's no like that is probably one of the biggest things, is that the mentality that's bred over there in Asia and in Korea more specifically in this case is, be excellent, and it requires a lot of hard work, and you're not going to get to do what you want to do, and if you don't want to do this, then it's going to suck even more than if you did want to do this, and it's obviously still going to suck in some senses because you're going to be grinding all day all night, but at least if you're actually enjoying the work in that sense, because it is work to improve yourself.
I mean, everything is work at the end of the day.
Yeah.
All modern games are chores, so...
Right. Well, that's the thing, is we want to avoid that in our own work, but we also want to provide, like, I think one of the untapped potentials of video games in general is, or I should say underutilized, is the ability to allow people to actually improve as individuals and more, I guess, more zeroed in, speaking as gamers, as players of that particular game. Like, they can improve in that sense, and if they can conquer the challenges that are facing them in this digital environment, they can hopefully, subconsciously or otherwise, take the lessons that they learned about it requiring hard work and practice and studying the material and trying to find solutions that where previously
that's
they couldn't
why I
imagine
say
any.
you need a way to measure your improvement.
Yeah. Well, that's what we were talking about metrics for and stuff.
Yeah, but I want to go even beyond that. I want to say that the entire concept of difficulty levels is dumb and shouldn't exist. I think that a game should be difficult right from the get-go. I think that a game should be like R-Type 3 right from the get-go. I think that R-Type 3 should be your target goal for a casual level game, where you cannot get past the first level unless you improve. R-Type 3 has an unstable difficulty curve, but it is, I would say, otherwise... like, for example, I think like Zone 2 is much harder than like Zone... I don't remember the exact zone. I think it was Zone 4 or something like that. Like, the difficulty curve between the zones is kind of wild and imbalanced. But overall, I would say that is the difficulty curve you should strive for when making something targeting a casual audience. I mean, it took me only 7 hours to get through it. It's a 40-minute game, but, I got through it in like one day. And that's not something you can do with the vast majority of titles out there, regardless of how easy they are, because of how much fucking filler there is.
Right.
And you come out of it having gained nothing. You don't gain anything from playing any of these shitty fucking walking simulators or point and click adventures. You don't come out of it feeling anything. You don't come out of it feeling either, fulfilled as a player or fulfilled as a consumer. It's just dull grind.
No, that's why I completely abandoned Deus Ex after a few streams, is because it was very clearly not going to get better. That particular example.
I tried to play that game a while back. I couldn't get past the tutorial because the whole premise was just so boring. And the whole presentation was so fucking boring. And, I mean, there's a lot of games like that I dropped within, like, 20 minutes to I basically give a game, like, 20 minutes to half an hour. And if it doesn't, like, really catch me, I just drop it for good. And Dude Sex was one of those games. It was just dull as fuck.
Yeah. You didn't miss much.
No, I don't imagine. Any of those games that are hyped up, like, you always pay attention to the kind of people that hype them up.
Yeah.
It really tells you a lot about the game. Kind of like Half-Life,
Yeah, well, the same kind of people who go into my comment section screeching about me not liking Black Mesa are probably the same kind of people that were into Dude Sex, so get them out of here.
All I had to look at with Black Mesa was that menu, and that really told me everything about the project. If you can't even place lights correctly, I don't even want to know what you're going to try to do with gunplay and shit like that. Like, if you can't even get the basics down, you don't deserve my attention for anything past that point.
Yeah, that's
And
almost
really,
like a
that's the
warning
thing.
sign.
Like that's the thing. Like all of this really plays into like set a margin that you can measure improvement, and that goes on the developer side too. Like if whenever you're doing stuff like making a map or a mod or a game or something like that, and you are targeting, people who want to improve and stuff like that, you yourself have to be up to that challenge as well. And all these fucking like one of the biggest red flags for a game is if they call themselves an esport. If a game calls itself an esport, I just assume it's dead on arrival, and it always is. It always is. Because people who claim that their title is going to be an esport or whatever, or is competitive in nature, they don't understand how competition actually is created. They didn't do any research on Brood War. They didn't do any research on shmups. They didn't do any research on arcades. They don't actually understand how any of this stuff actually grew into esports. And because they didn't actually put in the effort to understand how this stuff happens, and they're marketing their stuff incorrectly, they're too dumb to actually make it succeed. And that rings true every single instance I could possibly think of. Look at the explosion of fucking MOBAs after League took off. Is just all of them just would spring up and then fall like a house of cards. Yeah. Every single fucking month you heard about 2 or 3 of them doing that. And it's the same about MMOs and WoW killers as well, as people just didn't do any research into why World of Warcraft succeeded and why it can't be replicated. Again, first bird gets the worm. It's the same with casting on YouTube. It's the same with professional play in many cases. It's the same with, making maps and mods and stuff like that.
Yeah, if you don't supply value with your alternative, then there's no reason for anybody to come to yours when there's already this first dibs one that everybody's familiar with. I mean, half the reason why people stick with a product is because of the number of other people who are also following that product in their friend circle or in their circle of people that they know. Social aspect of games plays a huge part. It's probably the only reason why games like World of Warcraft were there. Yeah. I mean, for sure, I'm not arguing that you should go that way, though. Like, I'm not saying that you should just go hard on the social aspect. It's just that's like kind of that's a more human psychological take on why these games and these other products last, despite the fact that they don't offer anything. It's because everything else.
World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
World of Warcraft, it launches, all your friends try it. Let's say like 1/4 of them like it. And then another MMO launches that you like, but now one chunk of your friends don't want to play. And chunk of your other friends who play with them don't want to play because they're not there. Yeah, it's just like you say, it's a ripple effect, and I've seen that.
Right. And that's one of those things
where you
actually
need
have to
a product that is actually going to grab their attention.
Exactly. You need something that.
And the same goes with playstyles. The same goes with playstyles. Like when you look, like let's take for example, you're making a campaign for Brood War, and you have ways to measure player performance and stuff like that. You also have to have ways to facilitate player expression on top of it. Which means that, skill expression. None of this shit that's really arbitrary, like quick time events, stick waggling, crap like that. Fucking walking, micro missions, all this other shit that basically like any dumbass can do, and it's always done the same fucking way.
I actually have to get to I've gotten to the point where I just throw in a debug plugin that lets me speed up the game so I can skip through these fucking micro missions at this point. I'm not tolerating it anymore. There's so many of them just have backtracking through empty installation maps, and it tells you a lot, because what'll happen is I'll have a hero that's like a Zerg hero that can regenerate and has some spells. So they've got regeneration and they've got energy. And so I just mash this fast forward button. Mind you, I'm fast forwarding like 5 minutes in game time in like the speed of 10 seconds, and nothing has happened. All they do is regenerate full HP. Like that tells you everything you need to know. So like that's the level of tism that we're at, where I'm just skipping all that stuff. I don't have time for that shit. I played Life of a Marine at like double speed the entire time. So yeah.
This is crazy shit.
It's terrible.
But yeah, I mean, like, having statistics is nice and all, but I think that having the game able to measure your success by, say, for example, how far you can get in the game, like, that's how games are by design, by concept. That's how they were until the West took over. And when the West took over, all that standard died. And that's why a lot of people flock to titles like Dark Souls, even though they're really, really bad. The fact is that you can't get through Dark Souls without at least, paying attention to the game. And that is something that is financially successful in the West. Dark Souls has proven that you can make games that people at least perceive to be difficult, and you can be very, very successful to the point that you've created the meme where something is the Dark Souls of something.
People
Dark
call
Souls,
Hydro
that game-
StarCraft Dark Souls, by the way.
Oh my fucking god.
Well, it's not people. It's that Chris guy that you were warning me about.
Oh yeah, that guy is actually stupid. Like, there's a lot of people that are like meme stupid, but that guy is like actually stupid. He keeps like showing this fucking Google document thing. He keeps bumping like 10-year-old threads and shit as if anybody even gives a shit about what he thinks about anything. And then he reads fucking Reddit, and he likes guys who are into nipple clamps.
Yeah,
so
listen,
like
there's some real
he's
weird
actually
shit going
deranged.
on. Yeah.
Oh, this reminds me. Someone asked me to ask you about some guy. I think Andrea Rosa.
Yeah.
You apparently had some opinion about a guy named, I don't know who that is, but
I did.
Yeah, someone said you had a rant about this Andrea Rosa guy.
Well, I think it's a girl. That's what Chris keeps telling me. But also, I think Chris is insane. Who knows who this?
I think Chris is like 12 years old.
Yeah, well, he's a full-time programmer at 12 years old. It's pretty impressive. So
I don't know what he's programming besides his own fucking diapers.
Andrea Rosa is somebody who posted in Started about their campaign, and they were saying that they assumed that everybody, like, they're still, not only are they making it so that it's compatible with remastered, so they're not modding, they're also not they're not even making it in Brood War. Like, they don't even enable Brood War tech, and their line of logic is that they assume most people have vanilla, but maybe they won't have Brood War. And there was also some other thing that was like they don't even disable the Brood War units, because if you do that, the map becomes a Brood War only map. So you can't. Like, that's a technical limitation. So if you do have Brood War, you can play with the Brood War units enabled, and then like they just kindly ask you not to use them because they're not intended. So basically, they were explaining that they don't even like to use SCM draft. They like to use StarEdit for this. And I said, well, they said something to the effect of like, everybody's got StarEdit, so everybody can open my maps and look at them if they want. And I said, actually, StarEdit doesn't work for remastered anymore. And then they said,
I remember that.
Yeah.
Holy
well, their
fuck.
response was something to the effect of like, well, you know what I mean, instead of actually addressing it. So that's the point where I realized that was actually the thread that got me to just quit StarEdit completely, because I realized like these people just change their fucking goalposts every time I provide them with like all the motivation in the world to abandon remastered, to actually mod, to do any, like, literally, like, here's all of the reasons why you would want to do this. It's going to be so much better for your work. You're going to be able to realize whatever vision it is a lot more, like, with a lot fewer compromises. And
I mean, I think that
all this other
Andrea
shit.
Rosa guy is probably the first person on StarEdit who's even tried to make a map or anything like that in the past 10 years.
Yeah, that isn't also on my server. It's a real fucking disaster. But I at that point,
I don't know
like,
why they even still pay for that website. They've never used it for
well,
anything.
it's Devlin who's doing it, and he hasn't signed in like 10 years, so he probably
doesn't
forgot
even
about
know
it.
he's paying for it still.
No, he does, because when the server goes down, they all DM him on Twitter or something.
Maybe that's why he does it. Maybe he's like scared like one of these autists is going to hunt him down and kill him or something like that.
Could you imagine?
Like that really wouldn't surprise me, because I mean, Devlin's not someone I'd think he's ever done anything with that game, at least not in any time that I can remember. None of the people I ever saw that ever did anything with the game. I think Voyager was basically it, and he didn't even post.
Yeah, he posts when he makes a mod, and then otherwise he sometimes helps people out. He keeps to himself, that gentleman. Maybe he's more active
Probably
on
for the
Discord.
better.
These people are
Started,
all
it's
on the
just
Discord. Like, even Devlin's on the
fucking
Discord server,
retarded.
but they don't fucking sign into the website.
Yeah, well, Discord was bad for a lot of websites because, I mean, it's bad for forums in general.
Yeah.
It just gives the people an excuse not to think. Like, it's one of the reasons why upvotes are bad, because it's like an easy escape out of the responsibility of really like composing yourself into saying something.
Right.
So, you know, it's much easier just to say like a one-liner or just to push upvote and then be done with it.
Yeah,
And
it
gives you,
really
that
kills
sweet
engagement.
satisfaction.
Yeah.
Yeah.
because it's like, oh, if all you were going to say is good job, keep it up, which is an empty comment anyways, and you should expand upon that to provide some context and provide value to your input. But if that's all you were ever going to say, which is already bad form, then here's just a button to do it, and it got progressively more
takes
and
out
more
everything,
dumbed down. Yeah,
It's actually like this is like an epidemic, and it's something like it's everywhere. I mean, we're talking about player engagement and stuff like that. It affects this too. Because so many of these fucking games, like just look at StarCraft 2. They removed early game.
yeah.
They actually removed early game completely. They just deleted it. It's gone forever.
Well, pretty soon you're going to start out with a pre-placed brigade. That's what I think. Just like all these custom campaigns start out the AI with 200 Thors or whatever that they don't use for defense. You just have that. But,
yeah, like that wouldn't surprise. Like it's like. Like it's the same fucking thing. You just keep removing opportunities to engage over and over and over and over and over and over. Pre-play stuff, micro missions, fucking walking simulators, all that shit. They remove the opportunity to engage. So now there's no metric to measure your ability, and then there's no metric to measure improvement. And then you see where we go. We go down this line where it gets harder and harder and harder to actually see the player like even trying to improve, even being pressured to improve. So what ends up happening instead is people like put in quick time events and gimmicks and puzzles and switches and shit like that to try to like say, well, now you've got to do something, but now it's an arbitrary sequence as opposed to something you actually engage with. It's just as Simon says, and then that's where the chore comes in. That creates a chore, and playing a chore is not playing a game. Nobody enjoys doing chores, so. Like you see where this line of thought takes you down some really dark rabbit holes that pretty much everybody has tumbled in at this point because nobody actually wants to make a game anymore. And this is really like the main thing. Like when I looked at my projects, I didn't want to be measuring statistics that much. I didn't really want to be feeding you numbers that much, except for what something actually does. Like it'll say it does this much points of damage. It has this much of a cooldown. If it has a cooldown, it interacts with the resource in this way. And then maybe like a one-liner that says a short blurb like, oh, this shoots a projectile that's vertical. This attacks in a thrust and stuff like that. So at least they give you an idea of like what it does, especially if you're investing some kind of resource into learning it and whatever. But the measurement of success would be exclusively done through the engagement. You succeed by surviving and proceeding to the next mission. Like that's a really simple margin that existed in arcade titles and older vintage games for years and years and years. It was a margin that worked. Like let's take Tetris for example. Tetris is a really, really simple game. Probably at least half of your audience is old enough to remember. And anybody can play Tetris, but to actually be good at Tetris, you have to be fast. And one of the main things that a game needs to be in order to actually be challenging is fast. And you can take something as simple as Tetris, you make it fast, it gets to be extremely difficult. Very, very, very difficult. That's one of the things about R-Type 3, is that it also forces you to be fast. It's a side-scroller. You have to pay attention to what's going on at all points. If you stop paying attention to the whole screen at once, you die. That's the main thing about R-Type 3, is it really teaches you to not tunnel vision on one thing that's going on. You have to pay attention to the entire screen. It's really important. And that's like a really, like, I didn't think that was that important of a skill. Like this was told to me before I started the game, is that this is what it's ultimately is going to happen. And I didn't think too much of it until I got into it, especially within the second mission, is that you have a lot of terrain to keep up. There's different spawn points that activate at different times. Things kind of move around. Things actually interact with the map in different ways. There's actually destructible terrain and stuff like that going on. You have to kind of like pay attention to that. And you have to pay attention to the whole screen at once. Now, that's obviously, a skill that you've just acquired at that point with a lot of those older games because they are like lower resolution. There's usually like less little details going on, but it's a skill that retains importance all the way up into like, say, Brood War, where, you're not just paying attention to what's on screen, you're also paying attention to what's going on in the entire map and the mini map. One of the most important things in an RTS that you pick up right away is paying attention to your mini map. You can see things on the minimap you can't normally see on your screen. That's one of the reasons why adding in extra zoom levels, like say what Supreme Commander does, negatively impacts the game because it takes out that skill expression completely. And a lot of people ask about the zoom levels and stuff like that when StarCraft 2 came out, and that's the reason why they didn't have it, is because at least somebody had told them, probably in marketing, that people were telling them not to do this, probably from the professional scene, which ultimately didn't really take off with StarCraft 2 anyways, because it was such a failure of a game. But it's really telling when you launch a title that is a successor to another title, and everybody jumps ship onto some other unrelated genre like MOBA.
Yeah.
Because your title is just so unfun to play. Like, that's really at the heart of it. Like, the professional scene wasn't as good, and they killed Brood War and stuff like that. But a lot of it just came down to just the fact it just wasn't fun to play. People would risk their entire career and their future in Korea and stuff like that, where, things are that, that bottlenecked and that tight, just because it just wasn't something they really enjoyed at all.
Well, the topic of the whole zoom level thing brings us nicely into the other idea that I think relates very well to skill expression and player improvement and stuff, is like, what do you actually need to improve upon? A lot of it ends up being related to what the game offers you as far as actions that you can take, and that is usually dictated, at least in large part, by the user interface. And there's a lot of deliberate limitations of the user interface in something like StarCraft 1. Like, you can't select more than 12 units, and rally only affects the move or follow commands. It doesn't affect mining or something like that. I think they automatically rally through Niduses, but it's only the move command basically, and everything that the move command tells you to do. It's not going to smart rally onto your resources and all these other things. So whenever you have a situation like a game like StarCraft, where you have so many intentional or otherwise limitations on the user interface, and you have to imagine what that actually provides as far as avenues for improvement. One of the good things that this provides is you can immediately tell when you're dealing with a player that is high skill and a player that is low skill, because of the fact that players who are low skill are going to end up, obviously struggling with the user interface more often. They're going to have more mismanagement on their rally points. They're going to have less organized rallies in general. So if they have like a whole stack of command centers, or rather barracks, then they're not going to rally them all in the same way. They're not going to know about camera hotkeys, or they're not going to use them as well. All these different things that feed into the idea of mastery over the mechanical elements of the game are going to be missing from a lower skill player. And it's going to be very obvious very, very early on what the skill level of the players actually is. So that's one example. Obviously, people have tried to sidestep that for a long time and try to figure out if it's a reasonable thing to even limit. For example, a lot of people have asked, does it make sense to remove the limitation on rallying for workers, so that your workers will automatically mine when tasked onto resources? In the game of StarCraft, I think it would actually be a very negative change, because it would disincentivize players to pay attention to their base. And this is one of the other things that this sort of thought experiment makes you think of, is what do these UI limitations result in as far as actions, and what do they result in as far as behaviors? Because a simple action of taking a worker that was freshly trained and tasking him onto resources, that leads to a behavior of constantly looking at your mineral line and constantly looking at your base in general, and having to change your rallies and having to do that in a more organized fashion, in a more deliberate fashion that takes more APM than just group selecting buildings, is one such thing as well, where you're going to have to use camera hotkeys, and you're going to have to use that in order to rally efficiently when you have large numbers of factories. And being able to do that also trains you to look at the number of production structures that you have in the first place. So whenever you're in a situation like that, you have to think not only what is this going to make the player do in a small enclosed vacuum where they're just doing this one task, but also what is this going to encourage players to do more broadly speaking. And if you're disincentivizing players from looking at their bases, and you don't want to keep the rally system the way that it is, you're going to end up dealing with something like the macro mechanics of StarCraft 2, which are literal chores, where you push a button and you get a benefit, but if you don't push a button, you fall behind.
I mentioned this before, but the reason why they added macro mechanics is because they wanted people to go back to their base.
Right.
Which was something they had removed with stuff like auto mine.
Right. So the smart rally system, in that sense, is a failing of the design team.
They created their own demons.
Yeah. It's a failure of the design team to realize that actually this is an important aspect of the game that needs to be considered, and needs to be preserved, and we're just going to do it through a chore instead of something more reasonable, which is obviously not ideal. So that's one situation I think where it becomes very obvious that stuff is real fucked up at a core design level when you're adding chores to incentivize behavior that was already in the base game and that you removed by streamlining a user interface thing. And that's what makes these things where you think it's quite an innocent idea that you're smoothing out some needless APM or perhaps what is on paper a very uninteresting task. And should players have to spend more APM managing their base, isn't there something more interesting that they can be doing than tasking workers onto resources when the workers are trained? In theory, yes, the answer to that question is yes, but when you consider the broader ecosystem of what you're actually dealing with as a player, for one, StarCraft 2 doesn't provide you with as many things to do as StarCraft 1. And for another, the things that it does provide are rather hollow, like these macro mechanics. And then you have to deal with the fact that you constantly have to be pushing these buttons on cooldown, as close to cooldown as you humanly can. And that's going to result in a very hollow gameplay loop where the punishment for falling behind on your button press chore is that you fall behind economically, as opposed to just having it so that a much more intrinsic punishment to simply failing to task workers onto the resources after they're built seems to be on its face like a much more reasonable thing, and also something that's more nuanced that maybe you still can make something happen with that. It's just very strange to me that so many people want to do away with stuff like this without they want to do away with these macro mechanics, and they want to do away with the old rally system, but they don't want to consider what that's actually going to change and what is going to what needs to be added in favor of this mechanic being replaced. Like, what do you lose when you enable smart rally? What do you lose when you enable smart casting? Now, I'm considering adding multi-building select to a limit of 4, just so that, not necessarily hotkeying either. I'm not sure if I'll allow you to control group, group those units into a control group. Presumably I would for consistency's sake, but if I do end up doing something like that for my mods, where I'm expecting you to build 20, 30 production structures instead of the usual 10 to 15 that you get in Melee in current StarCraft, that is an adaptation where I think maybe it makes sense, but it's obviously going to morph a lot of engagements. Just like increasing the UI limitation on selections, I was thinking of increasing it from 12 to 16 or 12 to 18 or something like that. That's obviously going to favor certain races like Zerg that are going to spam out a lot more units, or Bio for Terran, where you're going to be selecting a large number of units and for the express purpose of stim packing. This is going to morph engagements, and I'm going to have to keep track of how that, what actually does get changed. I'm committed to figuring out whether or not that's a good change, and obviously reverting back if it's not. But a lot of people just want to change it and never analyze it again after that. And the only reason the motivation for changing it is that it's too difficult for them, or they have some grievance with doing the action itself, which in my opinion is the wrong angle to take, because it's too subjective an angle. It's not examining what is actually going on under this behind the scenes, or more broadly speaking, zoomed out, thinking, what does this make me do? You're not really, encountering a deep level of analysis when you see these individuals that say, where are the UI improvements? I want my modernizations. They're just empty cries of, I'm too bad to do this. So it seems anyway.
Yep. That's basically what it is. This is why I say you need to have at least an understanding at the professional level of the game before you really start thinking about modding for this stuff. Because you need to understand what all this stuff actually is. Because every single change you do interacts with this stuff. Every single time you change the cost of units, every single time you change how long it takes for them to build, every single time you change the tech tree, every single time you change a map layout, it is a ripple effect that affects the entire game and the entire game experience for the players behind it. Now, if your goal is to make the game challenging, you might think right off the bat, well, I should make it harder to do stuff, but that isn't necessarily going to make it more challenging, because harder is something that it can be more difficult to really quantify what makes it harder. You can make resources slower or stuff like that, or you can make the maps more tightly confined or stuff like that, but that's not necessarily going to make the game harder. It's going to change how the game plays, which doesn't necessarily one-to-one extrapolate to making it harder. It just changes it. So you need to be able to make educated guesses on how this is actually going to make things harder, how it's actually going to influence the game flow, which means having an understanding of what people who have basically mastered the game up to the physical limit do when things like the map layout and the resources and stuff like that actually change. And you can do this within a static game by just watching people get put into extreme circumstances, like Jelizer drone drilling somebody twice in a row in a finals. That was really bizarre and unusual. It was also very unique and something you're going to potentially see within a low level, but not within a high level. And these really strange things do sometimes happen. And then you can understand, like, how did this player respond? How did he respond? Why did the one time his one game change differently? Why are things different in some places? Why did he make the decisions? Why did he choose to drone drill twice in a finals? There has to be a reason why, so on and so forth. This analysis is all there just to give you the tools to understand what's going on. These are not tools that can be defined by metrics or numbers or stuff like that. There's so much more to understanding this stuff than just looking at win rates and things like that. That's why win rates are bad. Do not look at win rates. Do not look at those kinds of statistics. Don't be like Blizzard. You cannot balance or design stuff around win rates. It does not work. It never has worked. Blizzard doesn't. That's why Heroes of the Storm is unrecoverable, and why they ultimately abandoned it is because they realize that they're dumb and it's not possible. Except instead of stepping back and saying, let's not be dumb, they just threw the baby out with the bathwater, and there you go. That's corporatism for you.
What you want to do generally, I think, is balance around the level of skill expression, the level of skill that you have to play. And going back to an earlier example of confining the map, making it tighter, having more choke points, that sort of example does make it more difficult to move large armies, but not because, you're trying to cover more ground than you should be, you're overextending. It's literally just a mechanical thing where you now have to spend more clicks moving your army around, which is why, generally speaking, I prefer wider ramps and wider bridges and than what are available by default, because of the fact that it allows you to move armies more often. Okay, now it's not an issue of actually fitting into a small space. Now it's an issue of, can I even build the large army to begin with? Can I move it out in an organized enough fashion to
now
deal
you gotta
with my
think
enemy?
about the distance between the players, because now you can
positioning.
reach his base with a larger armory faster and stuff like that
Right.
on top of it, right?
Yeah. I mean, a thing that I do a lot of in my levels is I have a wide path that maybe takes longer than a short path, but the short path is thinner, and so you can only fit like smaller squads in there. And so the idea is that you could flank. You could even have two players in the same space flanking each other, depending on how the height plays out and all this other stuff. That differently sized armies can still end up being viable in the same area in theory, and it's all down to what path you end up taking. And you have to say, if I have a large army and I'm taking this small path, I'm going to be spending a lot more APM over here, and maybe that means that I miss a macro cycle, or I do miss something back in my base. I miss rallying my workers to resources because I'm busy doing that. It's all feeding back into itself. So that's the idea anyway. But I think that is at least giving players the option to engage with either one of those pathways. It's more like the idea of balancing around skill level, balancing around skill expression, allowing players to express, not only their playstyle, not only their skill, but like how their understanding of the game and what they can actually do, and what they think they can do versus what they can actually do, and how those things play out. Making these educated guesses as to what you're changing is going to impact stuff. That you need to then test your stuff. You test your theories, test these hypotheses, and see what ends up happening.
Unit testing is so important.
Yeah.
You gotta test each individual thing and then test it in the environment.
Yeah. I mean, a thing that I was recently coming up, so often people complain about the scout in Brood War. They say, it's a useless unit. Just completely dismissing the fact that, of course, it does have legitimate uses in a niche. A buff to Protoss, or rather a buff to scouts, are a buff to Protoss, generally speaking. Like, it's a buff to an entire race. You can't just buff a single unit. And on top of that, something that I commonly say when discussing this is, if you really wanted to make the scout a more viable unit, all you have to do is reduce the supply cost from 3 to 2, because that's not just a reduction in overall minerals for pylons. It's a reduction in APM and overhead necessary to field an army of scouts, because supply cost is more than minerals for the pylon. Supply is APM of selecting a probe, building a pylon, shift tasking it back onto the resources that it came from, and doing that more often because you're fielding an army that has more high supply units, means that you have less APM to spend on battling, teching, scouting, doing all these other things. Mm-hmm. So that's actually a significant change, even though it seems like all you're doing is allowing more scouts per pylon. Well, you are, but you're also allowing players to build less pylons, and building less pylons means more APM for other things. And so, like, even a change in on paper as small as that, I mean, by that logic, you could also extrapolate and say that even if you just reduce the resource cost, it's not just that you can build more of them in the same time. It's also that you have more resources to spend on other things. And this now opens up time. Suddenly, like, you still have to have an efficient APM to spend the resources that you're now saving on scouts. So there's like all sorts of different analyses you can go down. But the idea is that it's bigger than just a one small change.
Yeah. It's like I said, it's a ripple effect. And as far as user interface is concerned, I think Armies of Exego had some good improvements in it, like being able to select buildings that hadn't been started yet, stuff like that.
Right.
And I think that's as far as you should go. I think that Armies of Exego is basically like the absolute limit that any kind of automation should have. I think that all forms of auto mining should not exist. And with rally points, I think that I'm not really at the level where I can really talk a lot about rally points. It's not really something I really read a lot into or looked a lot into. But having rallied units assume the commands of their main unit like it does in StarCraft 2, that shouldn't happen. I also think that things like steroids and buffs really shouldn't exist in an RTS unless it's for non-player units. Something that you have to keep track of when they use it, something you got to respond to, like say something like a boss does or something like that. But things like timed buffs, like for 30 seconds I attack 50% faster, stuff like that shouldn't exist. And I mean,
Stimpak at least has a
forget,
trademark, like a trade-off where you're losing HP.
It also doesn't last that long, so
yeah, it's like 10 seconds or something.
It's something you really got to pay attention to in any event. But like say for example, Warcraft 3, the Bear Roar is an example of a really badly designed ability. You just push a button, people do slightly more damage for a while. Great, that's exciting. It's really, really, really exciting, and it's inconsequential in many respects because it's not like units do damage in Warcraft 3, so it's not like the battles suddenly become instantly faster. But it is something you do because you have to, because it is more damage in the long run. If you have the ability, you got to use it. And like it creates one of those like I got to use this, even though it's not something that really feels like it's really making a difference because the game is so slow. Again, this plays back into everything. Everything has to be fast. Like the game has to be fast, and that means that each individual action has that much more importance. Like say for example, again in the Tetris example, when the game is fast, each individual thing you decide to do makes all the difference. Just like in R-Type 3. Each individual thing you decide to do makes all the difference. Just like in high-level Brood War, each individual thing you decide to makes all the difference. And then one of the ways that you express your skill level in these titles is how you manage your own physical limits of your ability to spread your action economy. Are you going to commit to focusing on the micro with a battle? Are you going to sacrifice your attention to go back to base and macro? And this largely comes down to like how good are you? Like you define your own limits in this case by your experience and comfort, and if you handle pressure well, like there's a lot of people who play very well, and then it comes to a tournament and then they play terribly, they can't handle it. I saw that a lot in League, that's for sure, because a lot of these people are very young and not actually that experienced. They're very good technically speaking, but it comes to playing in front of an audience and they can't handle it.
Oh yeah, that's a common issue, especially with young players, especially with North American players too. It seems like nerves really hit you really hard, or Western players in general, I guess. But it seems like in Counter-Strike, for example, you get this culture of being really mechanically skilled and not really knowing a whole lot of the broad spectrum strategy and the bigger picture when it comes to like how you slot into a team, and you very little understanding, but also very little training. It goes back to the player education for them. It's like if this works for people who are just starting out playing their first RTS ever, and it happens to be StarCraft 1, and they can look at their APM and a bunch of other stats and see how they're doing and see where they need to improve. And it's very obvious because you got out macroed or something, like, oh yeah, he built more units than me. It can also work at a high level.
Something constructive, right?
Yeah. And so I think it's definitely a topic that well, we could be here all day talking about it, that's for sure.
Yeah. There's a lot of things just to extract from the whole nature of disseminating your play. Like, I like to measure things basically based on in-game. like I said, in the projects I was planning, be it like the ARPG or a StarCraft campaign or whatever, I really didn't plan to track a lot of statistics. It was mostly down to like an end of like campaign performance. Did you get through the entire campaign without losing a single unit? Did you get through the entire ARPG without taking a single point of damage? Congratulations, you get an achievement that's actually worthy of being called an achievement, as opposed to like opening a menu or killing a boss you had to kill to get through the game anyways. Because that's great and all. But also like just being able to even see the end game mission screen, to even be able to see you have won. Like, to get to that point, I want you to have to improve. I want it to be a consistent and measurable improvement by how well you succeed. I think that's what is really like that's the defining feature of a game. A game is about improvement. Like, a game isn't just walk in and then you win. Like, if you think back to like board games, you think back to like Monopoly, you think back to chess or checkers or anything like that, they're always a measurement about skill. And in some of these games, there's a little bit of luck involved, like dice rolls. But a lot of the time, a person who knows what they're doing is going to succeed a lot more than a person who doesn't know what they're doing. There's always something you have to learn, and that learning in large part comes down to interaction and playing. And your success is measured by your ability to improve. And the more you improve, the more you succeed. Even against opponents who are high level, you will measure your improvement by how much better you're doing against them. Most of the people I played against in chess were way better than me, and I didn't play often enough to really understand what was going on. But, I can measure my success by the kinds of pieces I was able to take off of them. If I can take off their queen or something like that, if I can make them really work to win, then I can see that I'm improving, because I'm making them actually have to really think and struggle and make sacrifices to beat me. And that's an improvement. I may not be winning, but I'm getting closer and closer and closer. That's a measurement of improvement. So
yeah, I mean, you could actually reverse that and use that as an example of whether or not your product, your custom campaign or whatever is skill testing. Because I think back to like the example of people who play my content, and you've got all sorts of different skill levels who are on the server who are interested in the content. But if you look at Connor, who's basically the best player we have, as far as I understand, on the server, if I could make him work to actually play StarCraft and express his skill at playing StarCraft and macroing and expanding and taking map control, if I could really make him sweat to win, then I know the map is probably in a really good spot when it comes to difficulty. And I know that it is pushing the best player I'm in contact with to express some of why he is the best player, right? Express his skill. Yeah. And so it's the same sort of thing is, giving, also I think in general, the idea that understanding that there's going to be a wide variety of people who are playing your content, don't use that as a way to give them
something to work up on.
Right. Like, I think that the idea of your first map, your tutorial map being a bunker rush is great, because it accomplishes two things really early on. It sets the tone and tells you that if you're not willing to actually learn and improve and practice, and you not only will you not be able to win this mission, but good luck winning any of the other missions. This is not a campaign for you. This is not a product for you. And the other thing it does is actually force you to express skill. So it forces you to express skill in an RTS sense, and it forces you to express whether or not you're interested in improvement. And those two things are super important for weeding out people who are just not going to be interested in it. And the vast majority of people who are exposed to my content are, they're exposed to it through playthroughs, because they don't want to play the content because it's too hard for them. And what, I don't really have an opinion on that per se. I wish they would try and actually improve, but if they're not going to be interested in it, that's obviously on them. The most I can hope for is that they still end up enjoying the experience by way of watching those casters or those silent players. Like I think I talked about a while ago, where there's a guy who does like an abridged playthrough where he just cuts out, like he has specific choice cuts of gameplay and different things that he edits together, and people watch that and they see what he chooses to include, and that's like an interesting story that he tells without having any commentary. That is his commentary basically. So interesting in that sense. And I hope that people end up enjoying that kind of result. But if that's all, I'm not gonna commit myself to the idea that you should experience content through somebody else. Generally speaking, if it comes to interactive content, that's what you should be experiencing. And when it comes to commentated content, that's somebody else is taking this product, the custom content or whatever it is, and they're putting their own value into it on top of that to show like this is something else to watch and another thing to watch. So I think in that sense, whenever you have a situation where you are demanding improvement, that can be a lesson that is shown. That can be something that is shown even by a video, because you can have X number of attempts before they win, X number of cuts in a video that we were just talking about where it's an abridged thing is so many shots of the defeat screen every time or something like that before the victory screen pops up, and then showing the key battles that led to either one of those end results. And some sort of expression of that sort of thing I think is really interesting as a thought experiment anyway, is the idea that people are going to still be able to see how much skill was necessary. I think there's a lot that you miss out on. People are conditioned to expect that they can get the bulk of a game's story or a game's message just by watching playthroughs or just by watching those cutscene compilations. And maybe you can because there's no value in those ones, but in an ideal world, you'd be able to just look at that and say, well, I'm watching this on a playthrough, but I'm not getting the full experience because I'm not struggling myself. I'm not forcing myself to improve. That's one of the reasons why this product even exists, is to force a player to improve and get better in order to win. And to have victory be like that goal that they're striving towards, and how close they feel they are to victory being the materials that they can learn to extrapolate solutions to their problems on. Like what actually killed me in that run, what really did me in, what did I do and what did the opponents do, and how can I counter what they did and how can I improve what I did, and that sort of stuff. Like these thought processes are shared by people who are actually interested in improvement, and they're completely absent in people who are not interested and just want to be along for a ride, in which case obviously my content is not for them. But in general, I don't think interactive medium is for them in general. That's probably why they like shit like Black Mesa. So
yeah,
I don't know what you have to say on that whole idea of
well, there's a problem that developers like Blizzard have, where they try to appeal to everyone, and so they appeal to no one.
Yeah.
So it's important to really set your foot down right away that you're targeting a niche. You're always going to be targeting a niche. No matter what you tell yourself, you're going to end up targeting that niche, unless you just produce nothing. Like Blizzard just produces basically a slideshow of vomit that you just slowly slather yourself in like molasses or something. And you would drive away, like Blizzard drove away all their old players. You drive away what identity you did have to create a new identity. You always lose something to gain something, so on and so forth, so on and so forth. But really, you have to accept right away what it is you're targeting for and focus exclusively on that, and understanding you have to make some sacrifices to do that. You're going to have challenges to do that. In the case of, obviously gearing towards skill levels and stuff like that, if you do have testers, it really, really helps to have video playthroughs. I've seen that. I think Connor posts video playthroughs.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that's
an invaluable tool for analysis to be able to watch. What is it that makes him struggle? This is one of the things that you want. This is why I always go back to Brood War as you want to make a campaign in Age of Empires. You want to make a campaign in Doom. You want to make a campaign in whatever. Go to Brood War. Go to Brood War. Yes, it's a different genre. Doesn't matter. You go to Brood War because Brood War has the tools to do that. You have all the tournaments and all the competition and all the players and all the resources you need to make that same analysis. What you do when you're looking at that analysis is you figure out what is it that makes these people struggle. Now, of course, having a first-person view through someone like Connor playing your content is great, but the vast majority of people don't have access to those kinds of resources. They don't have access to people who are at least competent in skill level because, like I said, there's this meme that people have to be bad at the game to make content, and chances are most of our friends are also bad. But if you are one of the people who aren't like that, oh, that's great. Now you can make video content and analyze it, including your own playthroughs as well.
Right, yeah.
Because it's not just about, you can use your own content to improve and then base your content off of that, which is basically what I was doing. And then, if you don't have access to that stuff, you can look back at the professional stuff and you can figure out what it is that are making these people really struggle. Where is it that, performance is really measured at the most? Well, obviously, winning engagements and stuff like that. But what leads to winning engagements? Is it just about the map control? Is it about the map itself? When you start asking all these questions, then you can start asking questions about, okay, so how can I place this into my custom content? If it's about map control, obviously I want to have more expansions and stuff like that on my map. That's something Blizzard doesn't have. So now you understand why Blizzard's campaigns are so easy.
Right.
If not tedious. And then you ask about things like, so the players are sitting at full food. How is it and why is it they're sitting at full food, not doing anything? You think about maybe it's the map, maybe it's the positioning and stuff like that. Anyway, how do I put that into my content? How do I put positional play into my content? And then you look back at Blizzard's map and they're basically all bloodbaths and there's no terrain diversity whatsoever. And you think, oh, well, no wonder why there's nothing interesting going on in any of those maps. And then,
or at the far end, it's just like, one pathway to the enemy base and no other diversity. Yeah.
Yeah. So, you got to make those, you got to get into the mindset where you can make those extrapolations. And for somebody who hasn't ever done analysis and stuff like that before, they may not really understand what they're doing. So at that stage, what I would say is to actually just stop working on stuff other than learning skills, technical skills, and figure out how the game actually works. Like just stop what you're doing. Go check out videos and commentaries and stuff like that for the game. Get accustomed to thinking from the game from a high level perspective. Now, even if you're making a campaign who's for somebody of a really, really low skill level, like say, Jay Barino or any of the other casters, you're making something just for one of these, map crap kind of things. And you don't really give too much of a shit about if it's really challenging or not, but maybe you're still like somewhat invested in the actual game flow and stuff like that. It helps to go from a top-down as opposed to a bottom-up perspective. Because once you understand what actually makes stuff really difficult, then you can, balance your project in such a manner where it's not too difficult for your target audience. And it's not just about making stuff hard. Maybe you don't want stuff to be hard, but it ends up being really difficult and you don't understand why. This kind of analysis will help you understand why, because if you understand what high-level players do, then you can understand why low-level players may not be able to do certain things. Like, for example, the main thing that multi-building select exists, and the main reason why it exists is because people are bad at macro. People are too dumb and too slow to click multiple times. Or they forget to click multiple times. Or they forget to click at all. So then maybe you think, maybe my project shouldn't have the enemy throwing 200 food armies at you 15 minutes. And if I want it to be easier, you can make measurements based on that you may not make without having that information. And in order to become a good developer, you have to be, at least from a spectator's perspective, really, really good at the game. You have to understand the game at that professional level because that is how you are going to create content that scales up. Even if you're making low-level content for people who basically just lick windows for a living, you want the content to get more difficult as time goes on. Even if it's still targeting a lower level, maybe you go from D- to D+. But chances are you want your final mission to be a little bit more challenging than your first mission. But scaling difficulty is not necessarily so easy. It's easy to say, oh, make more units. But that's why difficulty sliders don't work, is because they just make numbers bigger. And that doesn't actually change the engagement. That doesn't really change much of anything. Or in the case of Blizzard, it invisibly makes numbers bigger, which is even fucking worse. It doesn't even tell you it's doing this, but it's happening, and it explains so much. Like, why does the fucking Immortals kill everything? Like, when watching your Legacy of the Amon playthrough, I really just, like, I don't know that there's a multiplier going on at that point, but I know something's weird because it always seemed like a lot of your units just melt for no fucking reason. And that is why, because there's invisible numbers going on, because Blizzard doesn't know how to make a game engaging. So what they do is they give them unfair upgrade advantage, they give them unfair money advantage, they give them unfair initial unit placement, they give them special units and special abilities that do special, neat, special fucking snowflake things. And then on top of it all, they give them an insane multiplier for damage. Like, what the fuck? So, any one of these things I just said, for anybody who actually plays these games as a casual player, it sounds dumb as fuck. Because it is dumb as fuck. It just doesn't make any sense to do that. That's not how you make stuff more annoying. That's how you make stuff unfair. And that's terminology anybody can understand no matter who they are. So why would you seek to make a campaign unfair as opposed to difficult? So this line of thought immediately should take you off to the point of, so what makes something difficult? How do you measure difficulty? Difficulty is measured through expression. Difficulty is something that is defeated through expression. A player's skill expression is a manner in which they interact with something to overcome something that is difficult. And what is difficulty? Difficulty is an interaction mechanic. It comes as a result of something that takes speed and precision to overcome. It's why Tetris goes from casual to difficult, just because it becomes faster, because it's already mechanically in-depth enough to be challenging just because it's fast. And Brood War is very similar. Now, UI stuff is really long-winded. I could honestly spend a really long time rambling about that, but like multi-building select, I don't think is inherently going to be super negative. And I actually think that the unlimited unit selection in StarCraft 2 is a trap more than anything, and traps are of course gay.
Yeah.
Because it baits people to getting their casters killed a lot. It's the pathing system in StarCraft 2 that's real cancer though, because you actually have to fight it a lot. It creates a lot of like unnecessary APM inflation to fight it, because again, the main thing is that it causes your casters to get killed a lot. And because they just like squeeze through everything. Like that kind of like behavior, like the what, like
it's very
the
counterintuitive.
worst kind of automation is stuff that tries to play the game for you. Auto mining, auto mine on start, I think is mostly there because some people load slower. Well, don't make your game load like fucking Unity, for Christ's sake. I mean, StarCraft's engine is so fucking bad, you shouldn't be taking that long to load. You shouldn't have to load a map on Battle.net to pre-cache assets to play the game. Like, that doesn't make any fucking sense, but that's what people do. And now
that's because there was a giant resource stall
worse.
for like upwards of a second anytime a new unit spawned in.
And that's why they have things mining at the beginning of the game. That's why they did that. That's exclusively why they did that, because the game performs like shit, and not everybody can click on their workers at the same fucking time because of that.
Yeah.
And like that's like, as opposed to fixing the problem, they boilerplate it. That is what Blizzard does. They just boilerplate everything. They copy paste and boilerplate all over the fucking place. Hacks on top of hacks on top of hacks on top of hacks.
I wonder how long until they automate the first worker construction too, or maybe they already did that. I don't remember.
I wouldn't be surprised if they already did that. I really wouldn't be surprised. I mean, they basically did, because they give you all the fucking
12
units for mid-game
you
anyways.
get 12 workers. What the fuck?
This crazy ass shit. Like that. This is lunacy.
Yeah.
But that's what they did, and now we scratch our heads and wonder why. Like I really gotta wonder why. Like, they already didn't like Brood War because there's an early game at all. And obviously, Blizzard's developers are bad at the game, so they have to change it in a way that makes them feel like they play better. But like, if that was really a problem, just give the player more initial resources or something like that. Like,
yeah, I mean, that's what they did in
Warcraft 3. They really
3
felt that necessary, but they just give you like 3 times the number of worker. What the fuck?
3.
We went from 4 to 12? That's fucking 3, man.
Imagine the reality.
This kind of Canadian math for you. 3. It's always fucking 3.
So, since we're 3 times 30 minutes in, should we? I think we should probably end up wrapping this sort of thing up.
Yeah, I've got a lot of stuff I've got to do. There was other stuff I was going to talk about, but it's going to take me a really long time to get into it.
I do want to go in depth about difficulty levels.
I was going to talk about action economy and stuff like that.
Yeah. We can definitely dedicate like a whole thing for that. Difficulty levels are, in so many words, it's just a matter of like you were talking about earlier. For one, it's creating unfair expectations or inconsistent reality of what is actually difficult, like the insane, just random invisible numbers like Blizzard threw into StarCraft 2 and stuff. It's not. Even when I was grappling with whether or not to add difficulty levels, like I was thinking, oh yeah, I can add difficulty levels to my campaigns, and then I can make it as difficult as I want on the hardest difficulty, and have that be like what's intended to be played, and then just create like an easier AI script or something, and then Jay Barino can play on that. That was my thought process. But at the end of the day, you end up getting saddled with this idea that it doesn't make any sense for the AI to underperform. Like in the story, it doesn't make any sense for suddenly, like the story has no difference at all, despite the fact that our AI enemies are incompetent in the lower difficulties. And that's what it is unless you like, numbers obviously don't make any sense from an engagement standpoint. You can't just tweak balance or damage or whatever. But in the case of AI and how well they perform, you can't just say that you're suddenly up against a harder opponent. It's usually the same opponent no matter what. And if that opponent is just performing worse at a lower difficulty level, it makes no fucking sense.
Well, the way I view it is I don't lower my bar for them. I give them something to grab onto.
Right, and that's way better, I think, for many respects. I really like the fact that you have to get you have to be at least this good to win. You have to have at least this much skill to pass.
Like I show them the route to getting their foot in the water, basically.
Right.
And
Yeah.
up to like if they don't want to take that, then
Yeah.
at that point, like my obligation to them is done. Like I've done all I needed to do, which is give them the access point. Now I have to put a lot of thought into what that access point is and how it's going to really like try to encourage people at that low of a skill level to really like actually like try to improve. But once I've got that solid footing down, if they still don't take it, there's nothing more that should be done at that stage.
No, you
like,
can lead a horse to
R-Type
water.
3
You
is a
can't
lot
make it
like
drink.
that.
Right.
Because R-Type 3, it gives you lots of breathing space when you first begin. And then after the first couple of minutes, you know, it actually starts to get pretty difficult if you've never played a fucking shmup in the last 10 years like I didn't. It gets really, really difficult. But it gives you that breathing space early on to say, hey, this is how stuff works. You can play around with the controls. Here's some really easy enemies. Here's power-ups and how they work. You know, here's options and how they work and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And then, you know, it gives you that you know, little bit of a helping hand. And that's perfect. It's exactly how it should be. And then we scale up from there on.
It seems like a
And at
corollary
that stage,
to
people say no, then you can't help them.
right. It seems like to me it's a corollary to early game in an RTS, right? Or early rounds when you don't have that much money in Counter-Strike or something. Like there's limited expectations for what strategies are going to be thrown out, limited expectations for you know what the enemy can actually do in this early game because they don't have a bunch of pre-placed junk. They've got the same exact stuff as you do, and you don't have a lot of pre-placed stuff yourself. You just got your workers in Town Hall and maybe some other stuff in a campaign context. You know, there's
It
limited
helps set the
things that you
pacing
can do.
too. Like
Right.
think about it. A best of 7 may be really, really, really long if they're all playing like Terran versus Terran on huge maps or whatever. But having that initial breathing space between the matches really goes a lot to setting the actual paces in the game because it really like helps people ground and like calm down from the last match or whatever.
Right, yeah.
Like there's a lot of reasons to have that kind of like pacing is obviously a huge thing. It's way too much to get into now, but it's something that you definitely want to consider when you're dealing with high difficulty stuff is how you're going to pace it.
Yeah, and you don't want it to feel like an overwhelming amount of information processed or must be processed in a certain amount of time, and you have to immediately go into a high level of understanding your action economy and all this other stuff. You don't want to like mandate that from the word go. You do want to get to the point where that is a reasonable expectation of the player and of all players involved, including the AI opponents. You want to get to that point, but you can't start out there, and that's the biggest issue with having a huge number of enemies that have a huge number of pre-placed shit and like half the map revealed at the beginning and all this other stuff. Is you need the early game. That's important for you to understand what's going on, and so reinstating
It also
the early
really
game
waters
campaign,
down the game.
Yeah, I mean, if you're only ever playing from the mid game, then you're missing out on at least a third, and that's 3. So.
Yeah. And then you feel like a developer, I need to make my map longer.
Yeah.
So then you start throwing fucking gamut. Like it's a slippery fucking slope.
For sure. So I'm sure we'll definitely be back, hopefully soon, but we'll definitely be back to talk about action economy and all of that other stuff.
Yeah.
But any other final thoughts you had along this line?
I've really got a fart.
Oh, shit. I
hope
shit,
not.
So.
I really hope not. I mean, that too, but I hope that doesn't come before the first one. Otherwise, my pizza's going to get soiled.
Thigh squeezer.
Thigh pleaser.